If you told me a year ago that my life would unravel like this, I would have laughed it off. My wife, Amy, and I seemed like the couple everyone envied. We had a cute little house in the suburbs with a neat front lawn, 2 kids who were the center of our world, and a marriage that I thought was rock solid. I used to come home after work, drop my bag by the door, and hear laughter spilling out from the kitchen. Amy would be cooking dinner, the kids tugging at her apron, begging for tastes of whatever she was making. It was that picture-perfect kind of life. At least, I thought it was. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. I worked as an IT technician, and Amy ran a small home bakery that had really started to take off in the last couple of years. I was proud of her. She was creative, ambitious, and had this knack for turning a simple idea into something extraordinary. I loved bragging about her cakes to my coworkers. I thought we were a team, building a life together. The nights were my favorite. Once the kids were in bed, we'd curl up on the couch and watch whatever show we were binging. She'd rest her head on my shoulder, and I'd feel like the luckiest guy in the world. But looking back, maybe I missed something. Maybe there were cracks I didn't notice, or maybe I didn't want to notice. Because that perfect little life, it was about to come crashing down. It started small, as these things usually do. Little moments that felt off but didn't quite register as significant. At the time, I brushed them off as nothing. I had no idea that those tiny, nagging doubts would eventually lead me to the truth, the kind of truth that punches you in the gut and leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew. The first time I noticed something was off, it didn't feel like much. It was one of those moments you brush aside because it doesn't seem worth making a big deal over. But now, thinking back, it's like watching the first domino tip over in slow motion. It was a Tuesday evening. I'd just gotten home from work, and the house smelled amazing. Amy had been baking again. The kids were in the living room, sprawled out with their Legos, and Amy was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone. She didn't hear me come in at first, so I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. It was one of those, I'm so lucky, moments, you know. But then, she saw me. Or, rather, she heard me. I set my bag down a little too loudly, and she flinched. Her head shot up, and she quickly locked her phone, sliding it face down onto the counter. I remember laughing and saying, "Geez, it's just me. You look like you got caught doing something." Her response was immediate. "Oh, please. I was just looking at cake ideas," she said, rolling her eyes like I was being ridiculous. She turned to grab a tray of cookies from the oven, and that was the end of it, for her. For me, it stuck. It wasn't just the way she flinched or how fast she locked her phone. It was her tone. Normally, Amy had this light, playful way of brushing things off, but this was different. There was an edge to it, a sharpness that made me feel like I'd stepped into territory I wasn't supposed to. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop noticing how glued to her phone she was. She'd always been a big texter, group chats with friends, moms from school, you name it, but this felt different. She'd tilt the screen away if I walked by, and there were more moments where she'd chuckle to herself but wouldn't say what it was about. I started joking about it. "Who's the comedian?" or "What's so funny?" Every time, she'd just shrug it off. "Oh, just Sarah sending me memes," or "Nothing, just this bakery forum I'm on." At first, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Why wouldn't I? We'd been together for 10 years. She wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend. But there was something else. Something quieter but harder to ignore. She'd started staying up late, even after the kids went to bed. Normally, we'd watch TV together, but now she'd say she was exhausted and go to bed early, only I could see the faint glow of her phone screen through the crack in the door. I started telling myself stories to explain it all. Maybe she was planning a surprise for me. Maybe she was just diving deep into her bakery stuff. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband. Still, it left a knot in my stomach that I couldn't untangle. They say your gut never lies, but I've always been the kind of person who needs more than just a feeling to go on. I need proof, facts, something tangible. Still, over the next few weeks, that gnawing sense of unease kept growing, like a slow burn I couldn't put out. Amy wasn't acting like herself. It was in the little things, how she'd smile less, or how she'd seem distracted, even during dinner with the kids. The worst part was how she'd started pulling away from me. She wasn't cruel or cold, but it felt like she was somewhere else entirely, like her body was in the room, but her mind was miles away. One night, I decided to address it. I figured maybe I was overthinking things, and all it would take was a conversation to clear the air. We were sitting on the couch, and she was scrolling through her phone again. "Hey," I started, keeping my tone light. "Is everything okay?" She looked up at me, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, fumbling for the right words. "You've just seemed off lately. Like, distant or stressed. Is something going on?" She stared at me for a second too long, and I saw it, the flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt? Panic? I wasn't sure. Then she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just busy with work stuff and the bakery." "You're imagining things." I nodded, forcing a smile back, but my chest felt heavy. Her words were reasonable, but the way she said them wasn't. It felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for that moment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every strange moment over the past month. The locked phone. The late nights. The way she laughed at things she wouldn't share. It all felt wrong. And then, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was around midnight, and I'd gotten up to grab a glass of water. As I walked past the bedroom door, I noticed a faint light coming from the crack under it. Amy was still awake, on her phone. Quietly, I leaned closer, trying to make out what she was doing. I heard her laugh softly, followed by the sound of typing. My stomach twisted. Who was she talking to at this hour? I wanted to barge in and demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to her giggle and whisper into the phone. Eventually, I went back to bed, but the damage was done. This wasn't just in my head. Something was happening, and I needed to figure out what. It was a Friday night when the last shred of doubt disappeared. Amy had gone to bed early, claiming she was exhausted from a long day. The kids were at my parents' house for a sleepover, so the house was eerily quiet. I was sitting on the couch, half watching a late-night show, but my mind kept drifting back to her behavior. Her phone was on the coffee table, face down as always. Normally, I would have left it alone, but that night was different. That night, curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. I stared at the phone for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't the type to snoop. I hated the idea of violating her privacy. But something deep inside me screamed that I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Finally, I picked it up. The screen lit up, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Her wallpaper was a picture of the kids at the beach, smiling and carefree. My hands shook as I swiped up, only to be met with the lock screen. She'd changed her password. That was new. Amy and I had always known each other's passcodes. It wasn't even something we'd discussed, it just happened naturally over the years. But now, she'd locked me out. I put the phone down, my stomach churning. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. But before I could convince myself to drop it, the screen lit up again. It was a notification. A text. The message preview read, "Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was amazing." For a second, I couldn't breathe. My eyes locked on the name above the message, Sarah. Sarah. That didn't make sense. Amy's best friend was named Sarah, but this wasn't how she talked. I grabbed the phone again, my mind racing. Was it a joke? Some kind of misunderstanding? But then I saw the text right below it: "When can we meet again? I miss you already." The air left my lungs. My hands felt numb. I stared at the screen, hoping it would somehow change, hoping there was some explanation that didn't involve the one thing I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. Amy was having an affair. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind a mess of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I thought about confronting her right then, but I didn't know what to say. I wasn't ready. I needed more. I didn't sleep that night. After seeing those texts, I felt like my body was stuck in fight-or-flight mode. My heart wouldn't stop pounding, and my thoughts were racing so fast that I couldn't catch a single one. I kept asking myself how I'd missed it, how long it had been going on, and, most of all, why she'd done it. By the time the sun rose, I was running on pure adrenaline. Amy got up around 7 a.m., looking well-rested, like she didn't have a care in the world. She walked into the kitchen, smiling as she poured herself a cup of coffee. I stood in the doorway, holding her phone in my hand. "Morning," she said, her voice light and cheerful. But when she saw my face, the smile disappeared. "What's wrong?" I held up the phone, the screen still displaying the text. "Who's Sarah?" Her face went pale. For a moment, I thought she might pass out. Then she did something I didn't expect: she laughed. It wasn't a genuine laugh, it was nervous, almost panicked. "Sarah," she repeated, stalling for time. She's a friend from the bakery forums." I stared at her, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "Cut the crap, Amy." I read the messages. "You're not talking about recipes." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands trembled as she set the coffee cup down on the counter. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then what is it?" I snapped. "Because it sure as hell looks like you've been sneaking around behind my back." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a second, I thought she might deny it. But instead, she just looked down at the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Those two words hit me like a freight train. I felt my knees buckle, and I had to grab the counter to steady myself. "How long?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and swollen. 6 months. 6 months. Half a year of lying, sneaking around, and pretending everything was fine. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Who is he?" Her face crumpled. "It's not serious," she said quickly. "It's just." "Who?" I demanded. She hesitated, then finally said his name. It was someone I recognized, a guy from her gym. We'd even met once at a barbecue. He'd shaken my hand, looked me in the eye, and acted like nothing was going on. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to throw her phone across the room. Instead, I just stood there, the weight of her betrayal crushing me. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" She started crying, but her answers felt hollow. She said she felt neglected, like we'd fallen into a routine and lost the spark. She claimed it wasn't about him, that it was about how he made her feel, wanted, exciting, alive. Her words cut deeper than any knife. "So I wasn't enough for you?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. She reached for me, but I stepped back. "It's not like that," she insisted. "I still love you. I made a mistake." A mistake. That's what she called it. I couldn't listen anymore. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there with tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what to do or where to go. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. After walking out of the house, I ended up in my car. I don't even remember grabbing my keys, my legs just carried me there. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I didn't drive. I didn't even turn the car on. I just sat there, staring at the empty street, my mind replaying every word Amy had said. 6 months. That phrase echoed in my head, over and over, until it felt like it was screaming at me. At some point, I picked up my phone. I didn't even know why. Maybe I wanted to call someone. Maybe I just wanted a distraction from the whirlwind of emotions threatening to pull me under. But instead, my fingers moved almost on their own, opening Amy's texts. I'd seen enough earlier to know where to look. The messages with Sarah. The thread was longer than I expected. It wasn't just a few flirty texts or late-night messages. It was a full-blown conversation, stretching back weeks, maybe months. There were photos, innocent ones at first, like selfies and pictures of her at the bakery. But then there were others. Pictures of her in dresses I'd never seen before. Posing in front of mirrors. Smiling in a way that didn't feel like it was for me. My stomach churned. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up right there in the car. But I couldn't stop scrolling. The texts weren't just about last night or meeting up. They talked about things I'd never heard Amy mention. Inside jokes. Complaints about me. He's been so distant lately. I feel invisible in my own house. You deserve better than that. That one hit me the hardest. The idea of her complaining about me to this guy, painting herself as the victim while she lied to my face every day, it was unbearable. And then I saw it. A date. 3 weeks ago. The same night she told me she was working late at the bakery. I remembered it clearly because I'd stayed up waiting for her to come home. When she finally walked in the door, she kissed me on the cheek and said, "Sorry I'm so late. Long day." Except she wasn't at the bakery. She was with him. I felt a surge of anger so intense it scared me. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to drive over to this guy's house and confront him. But instead, I just sat there, shaking, tears streaming down my face. Eventually, I called my best friend, Mark. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy but concerned. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "No," I said, my voice cracking. "She's cheating on me." Mark didn't even hesitate. "Where are you?" "I'm coming to you right now." I gave him the address of the quiet street where I'd parked. 15 minutes later, his car pulled up behind mine. He climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word, his expression a mix of concern and determination. I tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just handed him Amy's phone and let him see for himself. He scrolled through the messages, his face growing darker with every line. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. He set the phone down on the dashboard and looked at me. "How long have you known?" "Since last night," I said, my voice raw. I saw a text pop up, Anne. I couldn't stop myself. I went through the whole thing. She admitted it this morning. Mark let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know what to say, man. I'm so sorry." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. Eventually, Mark spoke again. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I mean, what can I do?" "She says she's sorry. She says she still loves me. But how do you come back from something like this?" Mark nodded slowly. "You don't have to decide right now. But you can't keep this bottled up. If you need to get angry, get angry. If you need to cry, cry. You don't have to figure it all out tonight." His words hit me like a floodgate breaking. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding in until that moment. The tears came hard and fast, and Mark just sat there, letting me vent. She said I made her feel invisible, I said through the tears. Like it's my fault she went looking for attention somewhere else. But I've been trying, Mark. I've been doing everything I can to make her happy. This isn't on you, he said firmly. She made a choice. A terrible, selfish choice. Don't let her twist this around and make it about you. We talked for hours, the sun creeping up over the horizon before I even noticed. By the time Mark left, I felt a little steadier, like I wasn't drowning anymore. But I still didn't know what I was going to do. I wasn't sure what possessed me to do it, but the next morning, I found myself sitting in my car outside the coffee shop where Amy's friend worked. His name was Jake, and from the texts I'd read, I knew his shifts like clockwork. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else live my life. I kept telling myself to just go home, to let it go, but the anger bubbling inside me wouldn't let me leave. I needed to see him. I needed answers. When I finally walked in, I spotted him right away. He was sitting at a corner table, casually scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm about to hit. He looked exactly like I remembered, tall, fit, with that cocky kind of smile that made you want to punch him on sight. I walked straight up to his table. He looked up, confused at first, and then his face shifted when recognition hit. Jake, right? I said, my voice low but steady. He hesitated, glancing around like he was looking for an escape. Yeah. And you are? I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, leaning forward. I'm Amy's husband. His expression froze. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. Then, he leaned back, trying to look calm. Look, man, I don't think. Don't, I snapped, cutting him off. Don't give me some bull about how this isn't what I think it is. I've seen the texts. I know everything. He swallowed hard, his facade of confidence starting to crack. Okay. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my voice steady. Didn't mean for it to happen. You've been sleeping with my wife for 6 months. That's not an accident. Jake looked away, guilt written all over his face. I didn't know she was married at first, he muttered. She didn't tell me until. Until what? I snapped. Until you'd already gotten what you wanted. He didn't answer, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. I have 2 kids, I said, my voice breaking. 2 kids who think the world of their mom. Did that ever cross your mind while you were sneaking around with her? Jake looked genuinely uncomfortable now, but I didn't care. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the pain I was carrying. I'm sorry, he said again, but it sounded empty. I stood up, leaning over the table. You're going to stay the hell away from her, I said, my voice low and cold. If I even think you're talking to her again, I swear to God. He nodded quickly, holding up his hands. You won't. I swear. I'm done. It's over. I stared at him for a moment longer, letting the weight of my words sink in. Then I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, my hands trembling with adrenaline. It wasn't enough to fix anything. It didn't make the pain go away. But for the first time in days, I felt like I'd taken back a little bit of control. After confronting Jake, I drove straight home, but I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the driveway, staring at the warm glow of the living room lights, feeling like an outsider in my own life. The kids were back from their sleepover, and I could hear their laughter through the window. Amy's voice followed, soft and familiar, but it only made the ache in my chest worse. She sounded normal, like nothing had happened, like she wasn't the reason my world was falling apart. Eventually, I forced myself to go in. The kids ran up to me, throwing their arms around my waist and begging me to play with them. I smiled, ruffled their hair, and promised we'd play later. Amy was in the kitchen, pretending to clean but clearly waiting for me. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked at me like she wanted to say something, but I walked past her without a word. Once the kids were asleep, she followed me into the living room. I was sitting on the couch, staring at an old photo of the four of us at the beach. The kids were so little, both of them sitting on my shoulders, their faces lit up with pure joy. "We need to talk," she said quietly, sitting down across from me. I didn't look at her. "What's there to talk about?" She hesitated. "I want to fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I messed up, but I love you. I love our family. I don't want to lose you." I finally looked up, and the pain in her eyes almost made me soften. "Almost. You didn't think about losing us when you were sneaking around with him," I said coldly. "You didn't think about the kids, or me, or anything else. So why now?" She started crying, but I didn't feel sorry for her. "Not this time. I made a mistake," she sobbed. "I was lonely, and I felt like you didn't see me anymore. But it didn't mean anything. I swear." Her words felt like daggers. "It didn't mean anything," I repeated, my voice rising. "You lied to me for 6 months, and you expect me to believe it didn't mean anything? Do you even hear yourself?" She tried to reach for me, but I stood up, putting distance between us. "I can't do this right now," I said. "I need time to think." She nodded, wiping her tears. "Take all the time you need," she whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." But as I walked away, I couldn't help wondering if there was anything left to fix. That night, I slept on the couch. The kids came downstairs the next morning, confused about why I wasn't in bed, but I told them I'd fallen asleep watching TV. I hated lying to them, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening. Over the next few days, I felt like I was living in a fog. I went to work, came home, and went through the motions, but everything felt hollow. Every time I looked at Amy, all I could see was the betrayal. Every time she tried to talk to me, I shut her down. I wasn't ready to hear her apologies. The worst part was the guilt. As angry and hurt as I was, I kept questioning myself. Had I really been distant? Had I made her feel invisible? Was this somehow my fault? Mark's words replayed in my head, "This isn't on you. She made a choice." But it didn't feel that simple. Nothing about this felt simple. By the 4th night, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. Amy and I were barely speaking, and while she gave me space, I could feel her watching me, waiting for a sign that I was ready to talk. But I wasn't ready. Not to her. Not yet. Instead, I turned to the only place I thought might give me some clarity, her digital footprint. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to know how deep the betrayal went. After putting the kids to bed, I set up in my home office. The room felt smaller than usual, the shadows from the dim desk lamp stretching across the walls. I logged into her email, something I hadn't done in years but still had the password for. She hadn't changed it, not like her phone. The inbox was a mess, filled with work updates, spam, and messages from bakery clients. But it didn't take long to find the folder that made my stomach drop, archived. Inside were dozens of emails between Amy and Jake, dating back months. The earliest ones were casual, discussing her bakery and how she'd met him at the gym. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. There were jokes. Flirty comments. Then, full-on confessions about their attraction to each other. "I haven't felt this way in years," she'd written. "Like someone actually sees me for who I am." My chest tightened as I read his response. "You deserve to feel special. If he can't see how amazing you are, that's on him." The conversations were filled with intimate details about our life, things I never thought she'd share with anyone else. She told him about our fights, my long hours at work, even my habits that annoyed her. It felt like she'd handed him a roadmap to everything wrong in our marriage. The worst part was when they talked about the kids. She told him how guilty she felt, how she worried about what would happen if I found out. But then she'd follow it up with things like, I need this. I need you. I wanted to throw the laptop across the room. Instead, I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands trembling. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't some meaningless mistake. She'd built a connection with him, one that she'd nurtured and protected at the expense of our family. But why? What did he have that I didn't? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my face as tears burned behind my eyes. I thought about confronting her again, about throwing the emails in her face and demanding answers. But deep down, I already knew what she'd say. I felt invisible. I didn't think you cared anymore. The same excuses, over and over, as if they could somehow justify everything she'd done. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. I needed to talk to someone who could help me make sense of this mess. That night, I called a lawyer. The lawyer's office was cold, both in temperature and atmosphere. It wasn't my first choice to be there, but after everything I'd uncovered, it felt like the only logical next step. The lawyer, a woman named Karen with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, greeted me with a firm handshake. She gestured for me to sit, and for the next hour, I found myself spilling everything, how I'd found out about the affair, the texts, the emails, the confrontation with Amy, and my visit to Jake. Karen listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a sympathetic look. I know this is a difficult time, she said. But it's good that you're here. Taking proactive steps will help protect you and your kids, no matter what happens. Her words were practical, but they felt heavy. We discussed everything, custody, division of assets, even the house. It wasn't just theoretical anymore, it was real. Do you want to move forward with filing? Karen asked. I hesitated. Filing for divorce felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I didn't want to be that guy who walked away without trying, but how could I ever trust Amy again? Let me think about it, I said finally. Karen nodded. Take your time. But remember, the longer you wait, the harder it might be to secure a favorable outcome. I left her office feeling both relieved and suffocated. I had a plan now, a safety net if I needed it, but the idea of tearing my family apart still felt unbearable. That evening, I called Mark again. He'd been my rock through this whole ordeal, and I needed his perspective. We met up at a bar, and over a couple of beers, I laid everything out. You're doing the right thing, man, Mark said. Even if you don't file yet, at least you're prepared. You have to think about yourself and the kids. But what about Amy? I asked. Do I owe it to her to at least try? Mark shook his head. She made her choice. I get that you want to fix things, but trust isn't something you can just snap back into place. You deserve someone who values you, not someone who betrays you the first time things get tough. His words were blunt, but they stuck with me. Over the next few days, I reached out to a few other people, my sister, a coworker I trusted. Everyone had different opinions. Some told me to fight for my marriage, while others said I should leave without looking back. But no matter who I talked to, the one thing they all agreed on was this: I needed to take care of myself first. The decision didn't come all at once. It was like chipping away at a wall. Every conversation, every quiet moment alone, every lingering look at my kids slowly wore me down. A week after my meeting with Karen, I told Amy I needed space. We sat at the kitchen table after the kids had gone to bed, the house eerily quiet. She looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes as I explained that I couldn't keep living under the same roof, not while the wounds were still so raw. So, what does this mean? She asked, her voice trembling. It means I'm leaving for a while, I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could. I need time to figure out what I want, what we're going to do. Her face crumpled, and she started sobbing, but I couldn't let myself comfort her. Not this time. The next morning, I packed a suitcase. It felt surreal, folding shirts and socks like I was going on a business trip instead of walking away from the life I'd spent a decade building. Amy stood in the doorway, watching me with a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Please don't go," she whispered. I paused, my hands gripping the suitcase handle. "I have to," I said. "I can't heal if I'm here." The kids didn't understand. They asked if I was going on a trip, if I'd be back for dinner, if I'd still come to their soccer games. Each question felt like a dagger to the heart, but I smiled and told them I'd see them soon. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with mismatched furniture and a view of a parking lot, but it was quiet. Empty. A place where I could think without the constant reminders of what I'd lost. The first night was the hardest. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone, half expecting Amy to call or text. Part of me wanted her to beg me to come back, to promise she'd do whatever it took to make things right. But another part of me was glad for the silence. The kids called every night, their voices the only thing that kept me grounded. They didn't ask many questions, but I could hear the confusion in their tone, the way they hesitated before saying goodbye. As the days turned into weeks, I started to settle into a routine. Work kept me busy during the day, and in the evenings, I threw myself into anything that would distract me, reading, cooking, even going for late-night runs. But no matter how much I tried to keep moving forward, the weight of the separation hung over me like a storm cloud. I wasn't just grieving the betrayal, I was grieving the life I thought I had. The family dinners, the inside jokes, the plans for the future, all of it felt like a lie now. Amy reached out a few times, asking if we could talk, but I kept my distance. I wasn't ready. Not yet. The first time I went back to the park, it wasn't intentional. I'd been driving aimlessly, trying to clear my head, when I ended up there. It was the same park where Amy and I used to bring the kids on weekends, back when things were simple. I sat on an empty bench near the playground, watching the golden light filter through the trees. A few families were scattered around, a dad pushing his daughter on a swing, a couple walking hand in hand. It felt like another lifetime, one I didn't belong to anymore. For the first time in weeks, I let myself think about everything, not just what Amy had done, but the role I'd played in it all. I couldn't shake her words, I felt invisible. At first, they'd felt like a cheap excuse, something she'd thrown out to justify her actions. But now, sitting there in the quiet, I started to wonder if there was more to it. Had I been distant? Maybe. Work had been demanding the past couple of years, and I'd definitely spent more time in my office than I had with her. And when I wasn't working, I was tired, too tired to notice the little things, like how often she smiled or how often she didn't. I thought about the routines we'd fallen into, the nights spent scrolling on our phones instead of talking, the unspoken assumption that we were fine because we were still under the same roof. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing her. And maybe, in her own way, she'd stopped seeing me too. But did that mean I deserved this? That our kids deserved this? No. There's a difference between growing apart and betrayal, and what Amy had done crossed every line. She could have talked to me, told me how she was feeling. Hell, we could have gone to therapy or taken a vacation or done anything other than what she chose to do. The realization was like a weight lifting off my chest. Yes, I had things to work on, things I'd need to address no matter what happened between us. But her choice wasn't about me. It was about her. By the time I left the park, the sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink. I felt lighter, more grounded. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't consumed by anger or sadness. I was just, me. And that was enough. The courtroom was colder than I expected, both literally and figuratively. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting an impersonal glow on everything. I sat at one table with Karen, my lawyer, while Amy sat at the other with hers. We didn't make eye contact. I wasn't sure if I could look at her without feeling the mix of anger and sadness that had been my constant companions for weeks. This wasn't the first time we'd been in the same room since I left, but it was the first time we weren't trying to shield the kids from the truth. Here, there was no pretending, no facade of civility for their sake. It was raw, uncomfortable, and painfully real. Karen leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. Let me handle most of the talking." I nodded, gripping the edge of the table to keep my hands from shaking. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Most of it was technical, discussions about finances, custody arrangements, and dividing up our assets. Amy's lawyer argued for joint custody, which I didn't fight. No matter how much I was hurting, I couldn't take the kids away from their mom. But when it came to the house, things got messy. Amy wanted to keep it, insisting it was better for the kids to stay in the only home they'd ever known. Her lawyer made an impassioned plea about stability and consistency, but Karen pushed back. The house represents more than just stability, Karen argued. It's also a significant financial asset. My client has a right to ensure he's not left in a position of financial disadvantage, especially given the circumstances that led us here. The word circumstances hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Amy's lawyer glanced at her, clearly trying to gauge if they should push back. But Amy didn't say anything. She just stared down at her hands, her face pale. By the time we broke for lunch, I felt drained. Karen assured me we were in a good position, but it was hard to feel like a winner when your entire life was being dissected in a public forum. Amy approached me in the hallway, her eyes red and puffy. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, then nodded. We stepped into a side room, away from the noise of the courthouse. "I don't want to fight you," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want what's best for the kids." "So do I," I said, my tone even. She looked at me, tears welling up again. "I'm sorry. For everything. I know I've said it before, but I mean it. I hate what I've done to us." I didn't know what to say. Her regret felt real, but it didn't change what had happened. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said finally. "I just need to move forward. For me, and for the kids." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I get it. I really do." When we went back into the courtroom, nothing had changed. But for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could get through this without completely tearing each other apart. The apartment felt quieter than usual that morning. The kids had spent the weekend with me, filling the space with laughter and the occasional argument over whose turn it was to pick a movie. But now they were back with Amy, and I was alone again. I sat at the small dining table, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window. The city was waking up, the hum of traffic growing louder by the minute. It had been 3 months since the court finalized everything. Amy got the house, but I got enough of a financial cushion to start over without too much strain. Custody was split 50-50, which meant I got to see the kids regularly. It wasn't ideal, but it was fair. Adjusting to the new normal hadn't been easy. The first few weeks felt like I was living someone else's life, a quieter, lonelier version of the one I used to have. But over time, the silence started to feel less oppressive. I found routines that worked for me, morning runs, cooking meals from scratch, picking up books I'd meant to read for years. I'd even started seeing a therapist. Mark had suggested it, and while I'd been reluctant at first, it turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd made. Talking to someone who didn't have a personal stake in my life helped me untangle the mess of emotions I'd been carrying around. Through it all, the kids were my anchor. They didn't fully understand what had happened, they just knew Mom and Dad didn't live together anymore. I did my best to shield them from the worst of it, to make sure they felt loved and supported no matter what. Amy and I were civil, even friendly at times. We'd text about school events or the kids' schedules, and once in a while, we'd talk on the phone. She'd apologized 100 times, and while I wasn't sure I'd ever fully forgive her, I didn't want to hold on to the anger forever. It wasn't good for me, and it definitely wasn't good for the kids. One morning, while flipping through old photos on my phone, I came across a picture of the four of us at the beach. The kids were laughing, Amy had her arm around me, and I looked happy. It hit me then that I'd been happy. For a long time, we'd had something good, something worth cherishing, even if it didn't last. And that was okay. Life wasn't about holding on to the past or dwelling on what went wrong. It was about moving forward, learning from the mistakes, and building something new. I finished my coffee, feeling a small but genuine sense of hope. The sun was starting to set as we walked through the park, the golden light spilling through the trees and painting everything in a warm glow. My son was holding my left hand, chattering excitedly about a new video game he wanted to try, while my daughter clung to my right, swinging our arms as she skipped along the path. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt simple, no courtrooms, no arguments, no lingering pain. Just me and my kids, enjoying the day. I looked at them and felt a swell of gratitude. They were my constant, the one part of my life that hadn't fallen apart when everything else did. They reminded me of what mattered most: love, resilience, and the ability to keep moving forward, no matter how hard things got. Amy and I were in a better place now, too. We weren't the same as before, and we probably never would be, but we'd found a way to coexist for the sake of the kids. Every once in a while, we'd even laugh about something, and for a moment, it felt like the old days. I'd stopped asking why a long time ago. There were no answers that would make it hurt less or change what had happened. Instead, I focused on what came next, being the best dad I could be, taking care of myself, and building a life I could be proud of. As we reached the edge of the park, my son tugged on my hand. "Dad, can we get ice cream?" My daughter chimed in, her face lighting up. "Please. Pretty please." I laughed, pulling them both into a hug. All right. Ice cream it is." As we walked toward the ice cream stand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Life wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be.